Welcome to the Neurophilosopher, the podcast where we dive deep into the profound connections between philosophy's grand ideas and the latest discoveries in neuroscience and psychology. I am both a neuroscientist and a philosopher, and I'm genuinely excited to bring you another fascinating episode. Today, we're going to immerse ourselves in one of the most enduring debates in philosophy, the question of free will. In this episode, I'll guide you through the perspectives of some of history's greatest philosophers, like Spinoza, Sartre, and Hobbes, who each sought to answer this timeless question. Are we truly free, or are our actions determined by forces beyond our control? Then, we will explore how modern neuroscience, with key experiments from figures like Benjamin Libet and John Dylan Haynes, has drastically changed how we view free will. What do these scientific findings reveal about our ability to make choices freely? Lastly, we will discuss how modern psychology and the concept of neuroplasticity provide fascinating insights into our ability to strengthen conscious decision-making and regain control over our actions. Whether you firmly believe in your own freedom or whether you harbor doubts about your ability to choose, this episode will offer you valuable tools to understand the deeper mechanisms that drive your decisions and behaviors. So, sit back, relax, and let's embark on this intellectual journey into the heart of the free will versus determinism debate. By the end of this episode, you'll uncover a unique scientific perspective on one of philosophy's oldest debates, free will. We'll dive into how groundbreaking discoveries in neuroscience challenge the very concept of free will that philosophers like Spinoza and Sartre debated for centuries. You'll see how the latest scientific research offers new insights into how much control we really have over our decisions. Whether you're questioning your ability to choose or convinced of your freedom, this episode will equip you with cutting-edge scientific knowledge that could reshape how you think about autonomy and personal responsibility. Don't miss this rare blend of philosophy and science, where ancient ideas meet modern brain research. Well, let's get started. I love to say that free will is a timeless debate. The history of humanity is full of profound philosophical questions, but few are as intriguing or perplexing as the question of free will. Are we truly in control of our decisions, or are our choices merely the inevitable result of prior causes that lie beyond our awareness? The issue of free will has captivated philosophers for millennia, from ancient Greek thinkers to modern existentialists, and even today, the question has taken on new life thanks to developments in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. When we pause and reflect on our daily experiences, we often feel as though we have control over our actions. For example, you may feel that you're consciously choosing to listen to this podcast right now. You could choose to stop, pause, or listen to it later. This decision seems like a deliberate and conscious choice, but is it really? Could it be that this decision, like so many others, is shaped by unconscious processes of which you are not fully aware? This brings us to the very heart of the philosophical debate about free will. Philosophers have been grappling with this question for centuries, and their responses are as diverse as they are thought-provoking. On one side of the spectrum are classical determinists like Spinoza and Hobbes. For them, the universe, including all human actions, operates under a strict chain of cause and effect. Every event, they argue, is the direct result of a previous one, much like the laws of nature govern the movement of planets and the tides of the ocean. If every event is caused by something prior, then our actions too are simply part of this causal chain. Human beings, in this view, are not much different from the natural forces around us. We are just cogs in the great machine of the universe. Consider a simple example. Let's say you decide to have coffee instead of tea one morning. This decision might seem trivial, but it could actually be influenced by a wide range of factors beyond your conscious awareness. Your habits, the aroma of coffee in the air, your level of energy, or even buried memories of a particularly good cup of coffee. From the determinist's point of view, this choice might not have been as free as you think. It could have been the inevitable result of these various factors working together unconsciously in your mind, determining your actions in ways you don't realize. However, this deterministic view of the world, as logical and coherent as it may seem, has always met with resistance. If our actions are entirely determined by forces we cannot control, what happens to moral responsibility? If we are merely following a preordained script, how can we be held accountable for our choices? Can we still be blamed for wrong actions or praised for good ones if we had no real freedom to choose otherwise? These challenging questions have led some philosophers to take a more nuanced stance, developing what is known as compatibilism. Compatibilism, a middle ground? Compatibilism, championed by philosophers like David Hume and Thomas Hobbes, attempts to reconcile the idea of determinism with a certain kind of free will. According to this perspective, it is possible for our actions to be determined by prior causes while still being free, in the sense that they align with our desires and intentions. The core idea here is that as long as we are not being coerced or manipulated by external forces, and our actions come from our internal motivations, we can still be said to act freely, even if those internal motivations themselves are determined by prior causes. Let's go back to our coffee example. If your desire for coffee arises naturally from your personal preferences and is not the result of external coercion, a compatibilist might argue that you acted freely. While your habits or past experiences may have influenced your choice, the fact that your decision was in line with your internal desires means that there was a form of freedom in your action. You were not forced by an external threat or physical constraint. So even though your choice may have been determined by previous causes, it was still a free choice. On the other hand, some philosophers have taken a much more radical stance on free will. One of the most notable of these thinkers is Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist philosopher who believed in absolute freedom. For Sartre, human beings are condemned to be free. There is no external force or chain of causes that compels us to act in any particular way. We are fully responsible for our actions, and this freedom is both a privilege and a burden. According to Sartre, there is no escaping this responsibility, even when we follow social norms or give in to long-standing habits. We are still the ones choosing to do so. Let's consider a more significant decision this time, like changing careers. According to Sartre, even if it seems that this decision is heavily influenced by external factors, such as financial pressure, family expectations, or the current job market, it is ultimately you who must make the choice. Sartre argued that this radical freedom can lead to an overwhelming sense of existential anxiety. If every action or inaction is the result of your choices, then the weight of responsibility for your life falls squarely on your shoulders. At this point, the philosophical debate about free will remains unresolved. Does free will truly exist, or are we simply carried along by a web of causes and effects that we cannot fully comprehend? And this is where modern neuroscience enters the conversation, offering new and sometimes unsettling insights into the nature of our decision-making processes. Neuroscience, a challenge to free will. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a series of groundbreaking experiments that forever changed how we think about free will. Libet asked participants to perform simple actions, such as pressing a button, and to report when they felt that they had consciously decided to act. Meanwhile, their brain activity was monitored using an electroencephalogram, EEG, which recorded the electrical signals in their brain. What Libet found was startling. The brain showed signs of initiating the action, a brain signal known as the readiness potential, milliseconds before the participants reported being consciously aware of their decision. This suggests that the brain decides to act before the conscious mind even realizes it. In other words, the conscious experience of making a choice might be more of an afterthought, a rationalization of a decision that the brain has already made. Libet's experiments raised profound questions. If our brains are initiating actions before we are consciously aware of them, where does free will fit in? Are we truly in control of our decisions, or are we simply rationalizing choices that have already been made at a subconscious level? This challenge to our traditional understanding of free will has sparked debates not only among neuroscientists, but also philosophers, psychologists, and legal scholars. Libet himself was cautious in his conclusions. He didn't think his findings disproved free will entirely. Instead, he proposed a nuanced view. While the brain may initiate actions unconsciously, the conscious mind still has the power to veto these actions before they are carried out. In other words, we may not have the freedom to start an action, but we do have the ability to stop it before it's too late. Libet called this the veto power, suggesting that free will might not be about initiating actions, but about our ability to control or stop them once they begin. Imagine you're about to say something hurtful in a heated argument, but at the last second, you stop yourself. Perhaps your initial impulse to speak was driven by unconscious processes in your brain, but your conscious mind intervened, stopping the action before it was completed. This veto power could be a form of limited free will, a way in which consciousness can regulate and modify our automatic behaviors. Libet's work has inspired a wave of new research into the nature of decision-making, and in 2008, neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes took the investigation even further. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, Haynes and his team were able to predict a person's decision, such as whether they would press a button with their left or right hand, up to 7 seconds before the person reported being consciously aware of their choice. 7 seconds is a long time in the world of brain activity, and this finding suggests that our conscious decisions may be shaped by unconscious brain processes long before we realize it. Haynes's findings have fueled the argument that free will is nothing more than an illusion. Philosophers like Sam Harris, who is also a neuroscientist, have argued that all of our actions are determined by factors beyond our control, whether it's our genetics, our environment, or unconscious brain activity. According to Harris, the freedom we think we have is an illusion, a mental construct that helps us make sense of our behavior after the fact. Let's take another real-world example. Driving a car. When you're on the road, you often make decisions, like turning the wheel or applying the brakes, without consciously thinking about them. These actions are driven by unconscious processes in your brain, which allow you to respond to traffic signals and road conditions almost automatically. But what about more significant decisions, like choosing a career or deciding to start a family? Harris would argue that even these deeply personal choices are shaped by factors beyond your control. Things like your upbringing, your genetics, and unconscious brain processes that influence your behavior without your awareness. But does this mean we are entirely without freedom? This takes us to the role of unconscious processes in decision-making. To understand why we feel as though we have free will, even when many of our decisions seem to be driven by unconscious processes, we need to take a closer look at how the brain works. One of the key reasons behind this illusion of freedom lies in the nature of consciousness itself, which operates more slowly than many of the unconscious processes taking place in the brain. For instance, think about the last time you drove a car. You may have driven for several minutes or even hours without actively thinking about every decision you made. You weren't consciously aware of every gear shift or lane change. That's because your brain has developed a set of automatic responses that allow you to perform familiar tasks without expending much conscious effort. These automatic processes allow us to conserve mental energy for more complex or novel situations. This is where things get interesting. Although these automatic processes guide much of our daily behavior, we are generally unaware of them. Our conscious mind focuses on other tasks, like having a conversation with a passenger or planning the route to our destination, while our brain handles the mundane details of driving. This division of labor between the conscious and unconscious mind can make it feel like we're in control when, in reality, many of our decisions are being made in the background by unconscious processes. Now, you might wonder, if so much of our behavior is driven by unconscious processes, does this mean we're not responsible for our actions? If free will is largely an illusion, should we stop holding people accountable for their choices? These questions have significant implications, not just for philosophy, but also for our legal and social systems. This is where modern philosophy, especially compatibilism, steps in again to offer a way forward: moral responsibility and free will. Compatibilist philosophers argue that even if many of our actions are influenced by unconscious processes, we can still be held responsible for them. As long as our actions align with our desires, intentions, and beliefs, we can be considered morally accountable for those actions. The idea here is that as long as our choices are not directly coerced by external forces, like a threat or physical restraint, we can still be said to act freely. Let's take an example from criminal law. Imagine two people commit the same crime, but under very different circumstances. One person steals food because they are starving, while the other steals for personal gain, even though they have the means to buy the food. From a compatibilist perspective, both individuals may be acting out of unconscious desires or needs, but the context and alignment of those actions with their desires matter when we assess moral responsibility. The compatibilist view leaves room for moral accountability, even in a world where many of our decisions are shaped by unconscious brain processes. It allows us to distinguish between actions that are coerced, like being forced at gunpoint to commit a crime, and actions that arise from our own internal desires, even if those desires are influenced by factors beyond our control. This distinction becomes crucial in fields like criminal justice, where we must determine whether someone is legally and morally responsible for their actions. For instance, if someone commits a crime while suffering from a severe mental illness, their ability to control their actions might be impaired. In such cases, legal systems often take into account whether the person had the capacity to make a conscious and informed decision. But even outside of extreme cases like mental illness, the concept of moral responsibility can be complicated by what we know about unconscious decision-making. For example, imagine someone who acts out of habit, making decisions based on deeply ingrained behaviors or biases. Are they fully responsible for their actions, or are they being driven by unconscious factors that lie beyond their awareness? Modern neuroscience and psychology offer some fascinating insights into this question, suggesting that our ability to control our behavior can vary depending on the situation, our mental state, and even our training. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change. One of the most exciting discoveries in neuroscience over the past few decades is the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. This means that even though many of our actions and behaviors are shaped by unconscious processes, we have the potential to change how our brain responds to situations. In other words, our free will, though limited, can be strengthened through conscious effort and practice. Neuroplasticity is particularly evident in individuals who undergo rehabilitation after brain injuries. For example, after a stroke, some patients lose the ability to speak or move certain parts of their body. However, through repeated practice and rehabilitation, these patients can often regain lost functions as their brain rewires itself to compensate for the damage. This remarkable ability to adapt shows that our brain is far more flexible and malleable than once thought. But neuroplasticity isn't just relevant for recovering from injuries. It also plays a key role in everyday decision-making and behavior. By engaging in practices that promote self-awareness and conscious control over our impulses, we can reshape the neural circuits in our brain that govern our actions. Take meditation, for instance. Studies have shown that regular meditation can increase the thickness of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation. By strengthening this part of the brain, individuals can become better at controlling their impulses, resisting distractions, and making more deliberate, thoughtful decisions. Essentially, through mindfulness and meditation, we can train our brains to give us more conscious control over our actions, reinforcing our capacity for free will. Let's consider a practical example: sticking to a diet. If you're trying to cut down on sugary snacks, your unconscious mind might prompt you to grab a piece of candy out of habit. But with practice, you can strengthen your ability to resist that impulse. The more you practice saying no to the candy, the more your brain adapts to this new behavior, rewiring itself to make resisting sweets easier in the future. Over time, what starts as a conscious effort becomes a new habit, reshaping your brain's automatic responses. This process of reshaping habits and behaviors through conscious effort offers hope to those who struggle with impulsive or automatic behaviors. It suggests that while we may not be able to control every decision our brain makes unconsciously, we do have the power to intervene and change how our brain operates in the long term. The complexities of free will in real-life situations. The question of free will becomes even more complex in high-stakes situations where decisions need to be made in an instant. Think about a scenario where a driver swerves to avoid an accident. In such cases, there's little time for conscious deliberation. The brain's unconscious systems take over to react as quickly as possible to avoid danger. In these split-second situations, it seems that free will is largely suspended. The brain's more primitive systems, responsible for survival and quick reflexes, come to the forefront, bypassing the slower, more deliberate processes of conscious thought. These fight or flight responses are essential for survival, but they leave little room for free will in the traditional sense. However, when we move away from immediate life or death situations, the brain shifts back into a mode where conscious decision-making plays a more significant role. Everyday decisions, whether to work on a project or procrastinate, how to respond to a challenging social situation, or whether to make a major life change, are all examples of situations where free will can be more actively exercised. But even in these more thoughtful decisions, unconscious factors still play a role. Our past experiences, emotional states, and social environment can all influence how we approach a decision without us being fully aware of it. The challenge, then, is learning to recognize when we're being influenced by these factors and finding ways to consciously steer our actions in the direction we want. This is where tools like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, come into play. CBT is a psychological treatment that helps individuals become more aware of their thoughts and behaviors, challenging automatic patterns and replacing them with healthier, more intentional actions. By bringing unconscious behaviors into conscious awareness, CBT empowers people to take greater control over their decisions, effectively increasing their capacity for free will. Let's consider an example. Someone who struggles with social anxiety may have developed automatic, unconscious habits of avoiding social interactions. When faced with an invitation to a party, their unconscious mind might trigger feelings of fear and discomfort, leading them to decline the invitation without much thought. Through CBT, however, this individual can learn to recognize these automatic patterns, examine them, and choose to respond differently, perhaps by accepting the invitation and attending the party, despite their initial discomfort. Over time, this new pattern of behavior can become more automatic, reshaping the brain's response to social situations. In this way, therapies like CBT, mindfulness meditation, and other practices that promote self-awareness and conscious control can help individuals gain more autonomy over their actions, even if those actions are initially driven by unconscious processes. Free will and responsibility, a dynamic interaction. The debate surrounding free will is not just a matter of abstract philosophy. It has real-world consequences for how we think about moral responsibility, personal growth, and societal accountability. If free will is indeed limited by unconscious processes, how can we fairly judge people for their actions? This question becomes particularly urgent in contexts like the criminal justice system, where courts must determine whether individuals are responsible for their actions. Legal systems around the world are grappling with this issue, as advances in neuroscience reveal more about how unconscious processes influence behavior. For example, should a person with a brain disorder that impairs impulse control be held to the same standards of responsibility as someone without such a condition? Should courts take into account an individual's mental state when determining punishment, especially if their actions were driven by unconscious impulses beyond their control? These are difficult questions, and they highlight the need for a nuanced understanding of free will and responsibility. While we may never have complete freedom over our actions, our capacity for conscious decision-making plays a crucial role in how we live our lives. Even if our choices are influenced by unconscious processes, we have the ability to reflect on those influences, take steps to change our behaviors, and shape the direction of our lives. In this sense, free will is not an all-or-nothing concept. It is a dynamic process that involves both unconscious and conscious elements, and our responsibility lies in how we navigate this complex interaction. Let me drive you through the biology behind decision-making, and you will see that this is very interesting for our discussion. Indeed, to truly grasp the question of free will from a scientific standpoint, we must dive deeper into the biological processes that underpin decision-making. At the most fundamental level, decisions are the result of complex neural activity in the brain. But how do these processes unfold, and what role does biology play in shaping our sense of freedom? The human brain is an incredibly intricate organ made up of approximately 86 billion neurons, nerve cells. Each neuron is connected to thousands of other neurons through synapses, which are junctions where information in the form of electrical or chemical signals is exchanged. This vast network of neurons and synapses allows the brain to perform countless operations simultaneously, from regulating heartbeat and breathing to engaging in abstract reasoning and problem-solving. When we make decisions, the brain's neurons work together to process sensory information, evaluate potential outcomes, and select a course of action. But this process isn't purely linear. It involves a dynamic interplay between different regions of the brain, each contributing in its own way to the final decision. One of the key regions involved in decision-making is the prefrontal cortex, located at the front of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher-order functions, like planning, reasoning, and self-control. It's the part of the brain that allows us to think ahead, consider the consequences of our actions, and make deliberate, goal-directed choices. When we talk about free will, we are often referring to the conscious decisions mediated by this part of the brain. However, the prefrontal cortex doesn't work in isolation. It interacts with many other regions, including the limbic system, a group of structures responsible for processing emotions and motivation. One of the key players in the limbic system is the amygdala, which is involved in emotional reactions, particularly fear and pleasure. This means that even in seemingly rational decisions, our emotional state can heavily influence the outcome. For example, let's say you're offered a promotion at work that involves moving to another city. While your prefrontal cortex might weigh the pros and cons logically, higher salary versus leaving behind friends and family, your amygdala might influence the decision based on how the prospect makes you feel: excitement, fear, or anxiety. The result is a blend of reason and emotion, creating a decision that feels both logical and deeply personal. In this context, the idea of free will becomes more nuanced. Are you truly free if your emotional brain, which operates unconsciously, has such a powerful influence over your choices? This interplay between different brain regions also opens up interesting questions about the role of impulses and self-control. The prefrontal cortex is sometimes referred to as the brakes of the brain, helping us regulate impulsive behavior. For example, the amygdala might generate an intense urge to act in response to an emotional stimulus, like yelling at someone who has insulted you, but the prefrontal cortex steps in and moderates that reaction, allowing you to choose a more measured response. This dynamic between impulse and control is central to many discussions about free will, as it highlights the tension between automatic, unconscious reactions and deliberate, conscious decisions. In this sense, Free will can be seen as a tug of war between different systems in the brain, with rational, controlled behavior often competing against emotional, impulsive reactions. But what happens when the brain's systems are disrupted? Can a malfunction in neural circuitry affect our ability to make free choices? Let's take a look at some conditions that shed light on the biological limits of free will. Let's talk about disorders that affect decision-making, a biological challenge to free will. Understanding the biology of decision-making becomes even more critical when we consider neurological and psychiatric disorders that impact how people make choices. These conditions reveal just how vulnerable our sense of control can be, raising profound questions about moral responsibility and freedom. One such condition is obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, a mental health disorder characterized by intrusive, unwanted thoughts, obsessions, and repetitive behaviors, compulsions, that a person feels driven to perform. In people with OCD, the brain's circuitry that governs decision-making and impulse control can become dysregulated. Studies have shown that people with OCD have abnormal activity in the orbital frontal cortex, a part of the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, involved in error detection and decision-making, and the caudate nucleus, which helps regulate motor activity and routine behaviors. In a healthy brain, these regions work together to evaluate whether a behavior is necessary or appropriate. But in the brain of someone with OCD, this system goes haywire. For example, a person might have an intrusive thought, "Did I lock the door?" And even after checking, their brain continues to send signals of doubt and anxiety, prompting them to check again and again. The individual may consciously know that the door is locked, but their brain's faulty circuitry makes it incredibly difficult to resist the compulsion to check one more time. This raises a fascinating question. In cases like OCD, is the person truly exercising free will when they give in to their compulsions? On the one hand, their behavior is driven by unconscious processes in the brain that they struggle to control. On the other hand, they are aware of their actions and often feel frustrated by their inability to stop. This tension between awareness and control highlights the biological complexity of free will. Even when we are aware of our choices, our brains may limit our ability to act on them freely. Another condition that illuminates the limits of free will is Tourette's syndrome, a neurological disorder characterized by involuntary movements, motor tics, and vocalizations, vocal tics. People with Tourette's often experience an intense urge to perform a tic, and while they may be able to suppress the behavior for a short time, the compulsion becomes increasingly difficult to resist. Like OCD, Tourette's involves disruptions in the brain's circuits, particularly in areas that regulate motor control and inhibition, such as the basal ganglia. These disorders show us that while we may have a sense of agency over our actions, the biological machinery of the brain plays a significant role in determining how much control we can exert. The concept of free will becomes much more fluid when we consider that the brain can be both our greatest asset in making conscious decisions and a potential obstacle when it malfunctions. Neurotransmitters and the chemical basis of choice. To understand free will more deeply, we must also look at the role of neurotransmitters, the brain's chemical messengers that enable communication between neurons. These chemicals are essential for everything the brain does, including decision-making. One of the most well-known neurotransmitters is dopamine, often called the reward chemical. Dopamine plays a central role in motivation and reward-driven behavior. When we perform actions that lead to positive outcomes, like eating delicious food, achieving a goal, or even receiving praise, our brain releases dopamine, reinforcing the behavior and making us more likely to repeat it in the future. But dopamine doesn't just reward us after the fact. It also helps us anticipate rewards, influencing the choices we make. For example, when you're deciding whether to take on a challenging project at work, your brain's dopamine system is evaluating the potential rewards, a sense of achievement, praise from your boss, a promotion, and weighing them against the effort involved. This helps explain why some decisions feel more appealing than others, and why we sometimes find it difficult to resist certain temptations. But what happens when the dopamine system is out of balance? Parkinson's disease, for example, is a neurological condition in which dopamine-producing neurons in the brain degenerate, leading to motor control issues, but also affecting decision-making. People with Parkinson's may struggle with decision paralysis, where they are unable to make even simple choices. This is because the lack of dopamine makes it harder for the brain to assess the value of potential outcomes, leading to indecision and inaction. Conversely, an overactive dopamine system can lead to impulsive behavior. Addiction is a prime example of this, where the brain's reward system becomes hijacked by drugs, leading to compulsive behavior that overrides conscious decision-making. Addictive substances like cocaine and heroin flood the brain with dopamine, creating intense feelings of pleasure. Over time, the brain becomes dependent on this flood of dopamine, and the addicted person feels compelled to seek out the substance, even when they know it is harmful. In both cases, we see how the brain's chemical balance can significantly influence our ability to make free choices. When dopamine levels are too low, people may struggle to take action, even when they want to. When dopamine levels are too high, they may feel driven to act in ways they know are destructive. The chemical basis of decision-making challenges the traditional notion of free will, suggesting that our ability to choose freely depends, at least in part, on the delicate balance of neurotransmitters in our brain. The conscious and unconscious mind, a new perspective on free will. To further explore the intersection of biology and philosophy, we must now dive into the distinction between the conscious and unconscious mind. One of the most groundbreaking insights from modern neuroscience is that much of what we experience as conscious decision-making is influenced by unconscious processes that we are not aware of. The unconscious mind, far from being a mysterious Freudian construct, is a highly efficient system that processes vast amounts of information outside of our conscious awareness. It's responsible for everything from controlling basic physiological functions, like breathing and heart rate, to making quick, intuitive decisions based on patterns the brain has learned over time. One of the most striking demonstrations of unconscious processing comes from research on implicit bias. Implicit biases are attitudes or stereotypes that influence our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases are formed through a lifetime of experiences and exposure to cultural norms, and they can affect how we make decisions, often without us realizing it. For example, when hiring managers review resumes, they may unconsciously favor candidates with names that sound familiar or come from similar cultural backgrounds, even if they consciously believe they are treating all candidates equally. This is the unconscious mind at work, making snap judgments based on patterns it has learned over time, often in ways that bypass our conscious intentions. The implications for free will are profound. If unconscious biases are influencing our decisions, to what extent can we be said to be acting freely? The conscious mind might believe it is making rational, unbiased choices, but the unconscious mind may be pulling the strings behind the scenes, leading us to act in ways that contradict our conscious beliefs. However, this doesn't mean we are powerless in the face of our unconscious mind. One of the most exciting areas of research in psychology is the idea that we can bring unconscious biases into conscious awareness and work to change them. Through reflection, training, and intentional practice, we can reshape the patterns of our unconscious mind and align them more closely with our conscious values. The brain as a predictive machine. Implications for free will. Another fascinating area of research in neuroscience that has major implications for the free will debate is the idea of the brain as a predictive machine. This concept, known as predictive coding, suggests that the brain is constantly generating predictions about the world and using sensory information to update those predictions. In this framework, much of what we perceive as conscious thought is actually the result of the brain making predictions about what will happen next. For example, When you reach for a glass of water, your brain has already predicted how heavy the glass will be, how much force you'll need to apply, and how it will feel when you pick it up. If the actual experience matches the prediction, your brain simply confirms that its model of the world is correct. If the experience deviates from the prediction, say the glass is heavier than expected, your brain updates its model. This predictive system is highly efficient, allowing the brain to process information quickly and accurately, but it also challenges the traditional view of free will. If the brain is constantly predicting and adjusting its model of the world before we even become consciously aware of it, how much of our decision-making is truly under our control? For instance, when you decide to order a particular dish at a restaurant, your brain has already made a series of predictions based on past experiences, how the dish tastes, how satisfied you felt after eating it, and so on. Your conscious mind may feel as though it's carefully weighing the options, but in reality, your brain's predictions are guiding the decision. This doesn't mean that free will is an illusion, but it does suggest that the brain's predictive nature plays a significant role in shaping our choices. The key to understanding free will in this context is recognizing that while our predictions are based on past experiences, we have the ability to change those experiences and, in turn, reshape our predictions. Free will as a dynamic process. The deeper we dive into the biology and neuroscience of decision-making, the clearer it becomes that free will is not an absolute all-or-nothing concept. Instead, free will can be understood as a dynamic process, influenced by a range of biological, psychological, and environmental factors. On the one hand, our decisions are shaped by unconscious processes, neural circuitry, and chemical balances in the brain. On the other hand, we have the capacity for reflection, self-awareness, and conscious intervention, which allow us to influence our actions and, over time, reshape our brains. In this light, free will is not a static quality that we either have or don't have. It is a skill that we can cultivate through practices like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and intentional decision-making. By training our brains to become more self-aware and by working to align our unconscious processes with our conscious values, we can expand the scope of our free will and take greater control over our lives. This understanding of free will as a dynamic process also opens up new possibilities for personal growth and ethical responsibility. While we may not be fully in control of every decision we make, we do have the power to change how we respond to the world. And in that sense, free will is not just about the ability to choose. It's about the ability to grow, adapt, and improve our capacity to make better, more thoughtful choices. Philosophical discussions about free will have grown more complex as modern neuroscience has provided new insights into how decisions are made. Philosophers such as Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Galen Strawson have addressed the challenge that neuroscience poses to free will, and their responses provide a more nuanced perspective on whether or not we are truly free in our choices. Sam Harris, a prominent critic of free will, argues that our conscious decisions are merely the byproduct of unconscious processes. According to Harris, the neuroscientific evidence, such as Libet's experiments showing that brain activity precedes conscious awareness of a decision, demonstrates that free will is an illusion. He claims that we don't control the inner workings of our brain, nor do we control the circumstances that shape our thoughts and actions. For Harris, acknowledging this lack of control does not diminish our sense of responsibility or ethics, but gives us a clearer understanding of why people behave the way they do. In his view, we should develop a compassionate framework for understanding human behavior that doesn't depend on the illusion of free will. Galen Strawson takes an even more radical stance. He argues that free will is impossible due to what he calls the basic argument. According to Strawson, in order to be truly morally responsible for our actions, we would need to be responsible for the way we are, including our psychological tendencies, desires, and decision-making processes. However, since we are not responsible for the circumstances of our birth, upbringing, or genetic inheritance, we cannot be fully responsible for our actions either. For Strawson, this philosophical impossibility means that not only is free will an illusion, but any notion of true moral responsibility is equally flawed. No matter how much we may reflect on our choices, the underlying forces shaping those choices are beyond our control. In contrast, Daniel Dennett defends a form of compatibilism, arguing that while neuroscience does challenge some traditional views of free will, it doesn't eliminate the concept altogether. For Dennett, free will should be understood as the ability to act in accordance with our reasons and desires, even if those reasons and desires are determined by prior causes. He acknowledges the influence of unconscious processes, but emphasizes that what matters is our ability to reflect on those processes and shape our actions accordingly. Dennett's perspective shifts the focus from metaphysical freedom, freedom from all causality, to practical freedom, where we still exercise control over our actions in meaningful ways, even if they are influenced by factors we don't fully control. He believes that as long as we are able to act according to our desires and preferences without external coercion, we can still be considered morally responsible agents. This compatibilist approach has significant implications for the way we think about free will in legal and moral contexts. Neuroscientific findings have already begun to reshape our understanding of criminal responsibility, particularly through the emerging field of neurolaw. Neurolaw explores how brain science can inform legal decisions, particularly regarding questions of intent, responsibility, and moral culpability. In some legal cases, defendants have used brain scans to argue that they should not be held fully responsible for their actions due to impairments in brain function, such as damage to the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and decision-making. For example, consider a case where a person with frontal lobe damage commits a violent crime. The defense might argue that the individual's impaired brain function made it difficult for them to exercise normal self-control or fully understand the consequences of their actions. While such cases don't absolve the person of responsibility entirely, they raise questions about how much free will we expect from someone whose brain is biologically incapable of certain kinds of decision-making. Legal systems around the world are increasingly grappling with how to incorporate neuroscience into the assessment of moral and legal responsibility. If free will is not as robust as once thought, should our criminal justice systems account for that in sentencing and punishment? This brings us back to the philosophical question of moral responsibility. If much of our behavior is influenced by unconscious processes, to what extent can we still be held accountable for our actions? Philosophers like Dennett argue that even if our choices are shaped by unconscious factors, we can still be held responsible if our actions align with our desires and intentions. This view allows for a degree of moral accountability, provided that the individual is capable of acting according to their rational goals, even if those goals are influenced by factors beyond their immediate control. On the other hand, Harris and Strawson would argue that since we cannot choose our desires or the unconscious processes driving them, any notion of moral responsibility is fundamentally flawed. In this view, our legal and ethical systems may need to evolve, focusing less on punishment and more on rehabilitation and understanding the biological and psychological roots of behavior. The debate between these views is far from settled, but it highlights how deeply intertwined free will is with our moral and legal frameworks. Beyond the philosophical and legal implications, it's important to consider how social and cultural factors influence our sense of free will. Cultural neuroscience, a growing field that explores how culture shapes brain function, has shown that people from different cultural backgrounds experience decision-making in distinct ways. For instance, individuals from more collectivist cultures may prioritize the needs of the group over personal autonomy, which can influence how they perceive their own free will. In contrast, those from more individualistic cultures may place a higher value on personal freedom and independence, shaping their experience of agency. These cultural differences raise the question, is free will universal, or is it shaped by the social and cultural environments we grow up in? if decision-making is deeply influenced by the values, norms, and expectations of our culture, to what extent can we claim to be acting freely? For example, someone born into poverty may have fewer opportunities to exercise free will in meaningful ways compared to someone with abundant resources and education. This introduces a social justice dimension to the free will debate, suggesting that our ability to exercise autonomy is not merely a matter of personal psychology or biology, but also of social and economic conditions. Socioeconomic status, access to education, and cultural values all play a role in shaping the kinds of decisions we are able to make. A philosopher like Marx might argue that the illusion of free will in a capitalist society is tied to the constraints imposed by economic structures, limiting the real autonomy of individuals who are forced to make choices based on survival rather than true freedom. This perspective challenges the idea that free will can be understood in isolation from the broader social and economic systems that shape our lives. In addition to these cultural and social factors, advancements in artificial intelligence, AI, and neurotechnology are beginning to raise new questions about the future of free will. AI systems are increasingly capable of predicting human behavior based on data patterns. For instance, machine learning algorithms can predict consumer choices, voting behavior, and even decisions in complex ethical dilemmas with increasing accuracy. As AI continues to evolve, it may one day be able to predict our decisions with such precision that it calls into question our sense of autonomy. If a machine can accurately predict what we will choose, does that diminish our sense of freedom? Similarly, emerging neuroenhancement technologies, such as brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, could potentially alter the way we make decisions. BCIs are devices that allow direct communication between the brain and external devices, potentially giving us more control over our actions. However, these technologies also raise ethical concerns. If we begin to augment our brains with technology to enhance our cognitive abilities or decision-making processes, what does that mean for free will? Would we still be making decisions freely, or would our autonomy be influenced by the technology we use? These futuristic concerns bring us back to the broader question of whether free will is best understood as a spectrum rather than a binary concept. Free will is not something we either have or don't have. Rather, it exists along a continuum influenced by biological, psychological, social, and technological factors. For example, a person with a fully functioning prefrontal cortex and access to education may have greater autonomy in making decisions than someone whose brain is impaired by illness or constrained by socioeconomic factors. Understanding free will as a spectrum allows for a more nuanced approach to moral responsibility, one that takes into account the complexity of human behavior. This spectrum view aligns with Dennett's compatibilist position, where freedom is not absolute, but practical. We may not be free from all causes or influences, but we are still capable of reflecting on our desires and shaping our behavior accordingly. By cultivating self-awareness and fostering environments that encourage thoughtful decision-making, we can expand our sense of agency. In this way, free will is not a static trait, but a dynamic process that can be strengthened or diminished depending on the conditions we face. In conclusion, the debate around free will, influenced by neuroscience, philosophy, and cultural factors, remains an open and evolving conversation. Philosophers like Dennett provide a pathway for reconciling free will with the findings of neuroscience, while thinkers like Harris and Strawson challenge us to rethink our assumptions about autonomy and responsibility. Meanwhile, cultural, social, and technological forces continue to reshape our understanding of what it means to be free. As we move forward, it is clear that free will is not a simple concept, but one that touches on many aspects of human existence, from our biological makeup to the societies we live in. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope it has given you some food for thought about your own choices, your actions, and how you perceive your freedom. Perhaps next time you're faced with an important decision, you might ask yourself just how free you really are, or whether your brain has already made the choice for you. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where we'll continue exploring the fascinating intersection between philosophy and neuroscience, diving into new topics that will help us better understand our minds and behavior. In our next episode, we'll engage with another captivating debate: the search for meaning in an uncertain world. Drawing on the ideas of Nietzsche and modern psychology, we'll explore how humans, even when faced with a universe devoid of intrinsic values, can still find purpose and meaning in their lives. Between nihilism and psychological resilience, we'll discover how the creation of meaning is not just a philosophical question, but a fundamental biological mechanism. Until then, I encourage you to reflect on your own decisions, to examine how your thoughts and choices are influenced, and to see if you can exert a bit more conscious control over your actions. After all, as we've seen, while our freedom may be limited, it's not non-existent. With time and practice, we can all learn to better shape our behaviors and exercise our will more intentionally. Once again, thank you for your attention. If this episode has inspired you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments or explore further the many questions raised in this debate on free will. Until next time, and remember, whether you believe you're entirely free or not, what matters is how you choose to approach this relative freedom. Thank you.